With Blizzard's recent announcement of Classic World of Warcraft, I thought to myself, this is a game that came out in 2004. You know, this is a 13, 14-year-old game at this point. Would it be possible to build a computer for under $100 that could run Classic WoW at a playable frame rate? So, that's what we're going to do today. We're going to get the parts, we're going to put the build together, and we're going to benchmark it. We'll benchmark it in Classic World of Warcraft, Warcraft and Legion, PUBG, which we'll see how this is going to do, Rocket League, a handful of other games, and a few synthetic benchmarks, and we'll go through it all step by step. But first, a word from our sponsor.
Are you ready to enter the void?
If you love adventuring, whether it be traveling, exploring the fascinations of the earth, or diving into an online world, come with us. Venture into the unknown and step into the void at Voodoo Realm. T-shirts, cutoffs, hats, and more. You can find it all at voodoo-realm.com. Check the link in the video description, and check out their website for a chance to win your own free merchandise. Voodoo Realm. Step into the void.
One thing I'd like to add here is that there's a lot of videos out there on YouTube that show how to make a $100 computer. And if you look at those, a lot of these videos, they will go up to $110, $105, $120, $150, and that's fine. That's totally fine. But in this video, I was strictly sticking to a $100 budget. There was no way I was going to go over $100 for the case and all the internal hardware. Obviously, there's no mouse, there's no keyboard, and I wasn't originally including any software like Windows. It just happened I got lucky and I was able to get Windows with this. But my point is, if you're spending $100 on a computer, you are ultra low budget. You pretty much have to buy used parts. However, if you go up to even $110, $120, just $10, $20 more, that's a 10 and 20% respectively price increase. And $10 or $20 when you're talking at $100 going to $110, $120, that's huge. I mean, that's the difference from going from what we have here is a 10-year-old quad core, essentially one of the first consumer level quad core processors in a Q6600 here. And you can go from that up into like an i3 or maybe even an early i5 if you have another $20 on your budget. I mean, it's incredible what $10, $20 can get you more over a $100 build. And so, yes, I recognize these parts aren't amazing, but I was very strict about keeping to $100, and I think it's important to keep that in mind. If you want to build your own computer for $100, if you bump that budget up to $150, you're going to crush everything than my computer is able to do at $100. I mean, $150 is a massive difference over $100 in terms of PC performance. Before we get into the gaming benchmarks, we're going to run 4 synthetic benchmarks. The first up is Cinebench. Now, Cinebench is great for testing your CPU and comparing it to other CPUs. As you can see here, very top of our graph here is the Core 2 Quad Q6600. That is our CPU. And the red graph shows the CPU, the red bar shows the CPU single core, and the blue shows the multi-core, the full power of the processor. And if you look at what we have here, we're comparing it to a few other built-in benchmarks of Cinebench, the i5-3317U and the i7-4770K. And the i5-3317U is actually like I think it's like 5 or 6 year old laptop CPU. It's a mid-tier laptop CPU from maybe like 2012 or 2013, I believe. That is pretty much what we're looking at. We're relatively similar to a CPU for a laptop from maybe 5 or 6 years ago. And then if you look at the 4770K, we obviously get destroyed there in multi-core work. And compared to the Ryzen 1700 is the processor I have in my main system, just to show you how far behind our Q6600 is. In single core, we're honestly not awful, but in multi-core, we just get destroyed by a modern day processor. Next up is UserBenchmark. I don't really like UserBenchmark that much. Really, there's not a great way to compare between my results and others, in my opinion. I just wanted to show these scores very quickly for anyone else that uses UserBenchmark and would like to compare their system against ours. These don't really tell me personally a lot. It kind of, again, you can see at the bottom there, our single core CPU versus our multi-core, obviously quite a bit lower. It's actually about 4 times lower on the single core than the quad core, which makes sense because this is a quad core CPU. And otherwise, to me, these numbers don't help me a lot, but I wanted to put them up in case anyone else finds them useful. Our next synthetic benchmark is Unigine Valley. In Unigine Valley, we set everything to the lowest settings, and we ran it at 3 separate resolutions: 720p, 900p, 1080p. You'll be seeing a lot of those 3 resolutions throughout our benchmarks. Our maximum resolution, our maximum FPS, it doesn't really matter that much. I'm not a big fan of maximum FPS because, like the very end or beginning of a benchmark or during menus or anything like that, in-game, for example, maximum FPS is not really representative of actual FPS. But our average isn't terrible at 720p. We're getting an average of around 40 FPS, which to me is playable. And even at 900p, getting about 30 FPS average. Now, the concern is that our minimum FPS drops as low as about 10 FPS in 1080p and 900p. That's pretty crushing, unfortunately. But at least we have our synthetic benchmark done here. And again, if you want to compare this to your computer yourself, download Unigine Valley and run it, and you'll see how it looks. Another synthetic benchmark from Unigine, Superposition. I went ahead and kept the scale on the x-axis the same as the Valley to show that the FPS difference from Valley to Superposition is a massive drop. Superposition is a much more taxing benchmark than Valley, generally speaking. The difference between 720, 900, and 1080 isn't massive, really, but in any scenario, we're really looking at, an average FPS of 25 on the upper end to like 18 at 1080p. This is pretty crushing, but it is fun to see this and just kind of get a comparison again. And you can definitely see that as we ramp up the resolution, the frame rates do drop. All right, so here's where things actually get interesting. So we're running our first in-game test. And now, the World of Warcraft, classic World of Warcraft, there is no built-in benchmarking tool. So these tests aren't perfect, and you have to just do the best you can to kind of get a standardized testing between the different resolutions. Now, this first test is classic World of Warcraft from 2004. We're in Northshire Valley, which is the human starting area. And we ran actually 4 different tests here. We ran 720p, 900p, 1080p, and these are on the lowest settings, and then also 1080p on maximum settings. So we maxed out everything for that last test there. And to be honest, the difference in average FPS, average frames per second between 720 and 1080p, there's really no difference. What this probably means is that we're most likely CPU limited on this rather than graphically limited. However, when we go from 1080p to 1080p with the maximum resolution, which is the bottom 3 bars there, we can see the average FPS drops from above 80 to just above 60. So it's a 25% drop in average frames per second when we max out our graphical options. However, as far as the 1% low and 0.1% lows, they're fairly consistent in terms of the 0.1% lows especially. The 1% lows, we do see they kind of gradually drop from 720 to 1080p, but in my opinion, even 1080p at maximum settings is playable in Northshire Valley and classic World of Warcraft because we are seeing essentially 1% lows above 30 frames per second. So you'll be pulling at least, pretty much always at least 30 frames per second, upwards of 60 plus at max settings at 1080p. If that's a little low for you, you could even go down to the minimum settings at 1080p or somewhere in between, and then you'll end up somewhere between the 1080p and 1080p max results here. Now, one of the most important tests for Classic World of Warcraft is how can your system handle the game in Ironforge, especially when there are player characters around, right? And this is one of the laggiest, truthfully, this is one of the hardest parts in the entire Classic World of Warcraft to render and to maintain a good frame rate. So we are in Ironforge, again in Classic WoW, and we have around 100 player characters on screen, maybe a little bit more, maybe a little bit less, and I try to run all of these tests back to back to back, so there was as little time between them as possible to hopefully make some stable and fair comparisons. Now, what you'll see here is the average frames per second from 720p all the way up to 1080p at maximum settings. They're not wildly different. The low end is maybe 42, 43 frames per second, and the upper end is around 50 frames per second. That's not a huge drop. We're talking maybe 10 or 15% drop from the lowest around 720p, from the highest frames per second at 720p down to the lowest at 1080p with maximum settings. As far as the 1% lows, those are pretty much stable across the board, and even the 0.1% lows aren't wildly different. So pulling 40 to 50 frames per second average on this system in Ironforge with a bunch of player characters around, I'm pretty happy with this. This was the benchmark I was most worried about, because if you get a stuttery mess where you're getting down to 5 frames per second or 10 frames per second, even 20 can really be a mess to try and navigate around Ironforge. And I remember all the way back in 2004, my system, I would hide when I was in Ironforge, or if I was in Orgrimmar, I would never stand where all the people were because it was so laggy for me. But I'm pretty happy and proud to say this system seems to handle this decently. We're not getting 60 frames per second, of course, but to be fair, you don't need a great frame rate in Ironforge. You're not, raiding, you're not fighting, you're not doing anything most likely that will lead you to dying, but it's nice to be able to navigate without a lot of crazy stutters and frame drops. Now, this is my third and final WoW Classic benchmark. Now, this one was a little bit strange, so I wasn't sure the best way. I wanted to go into Molten Core and just kind of run around and get a bunch of mobs to chase me and see what happens when a lot of NPCs are running around and casting spells and attacking me. So we're in Molten Core, we're in Magmadar's Cavern, right near Magmadar and Lucifron, and again we ran our test at 720, 900, and 1080p on lowest settings, and then 1080p with maximum settings. Now this is, again, it's actually kind of strange. I don't know why, but the 0.1% lows seemed to get better as we moved up from 720p up to my monitor's native resolution of 1080p, which is welcome but sort of confusing. However, the average frames per second from 720 to 1080p are pretty similar. We're really getting, 70 plus frames per second average. When we go to maximum settings at 1080p, the frame rate does drop down to an average of just over 60, but the 1% lows and the 0.1% lows, those actually do also take a bit of a hit as well. Nothing catastrophic, but certainly lower. You're pretty much going to be looking at frame rates nothing lower than 20 frames per second based on this. And now, I admit this isn't a perfect test of a raid environment. In a raid environment, you'll have 40, maybe up to 40 player characters casting lots of different spells. When you get mages casting Blizzard and things, it does start to really chug more. It most likely would. I wasn't able to test in that exact environment. This was slightly representative of that. However, between the three tests, the human starting zone, the Ironforge with 100 player characters, and just playing around in Magmadar's Cavern, I'm very, very confident that this system is more than capable of running Classic World of Warcraft at a very playable frame rate. These are all, again, pretty much all these tests are at lowest settings, but even at the maximum settings at 1080p, I think things are pretty solid. And I think there's a middle ground there where you can really crank up the frame rate quite a bit at 1080p above the max settings by just turning down a few small settings a little bit. And I think you'll get closer to that 80 average frame rate that we have on the 1080p benchmark here, as opposed to the closer to 60 frames per second we have on the 1080p with max settings. I think there's a nice middle ground in there. However, my conclusion is that for under $100, this computer is pretty solid for Classic World of Warcraft, which was my main goal of this project. However, we've got a few more games I want to look through. Another question I had is, if we can play Classic World of Warcraft, what if we try Modern World of Warcraft? What if we're in Legion? And I didn't have a great test for this, but I did one quick test.
where I basically took laps around Dalaran, because I figured, this is Dalaran in the Broken Shore, I figured Dalaran is a good place to get a lot of player characters around. It's the most player characters I could easily find, and you'll see, different mounts, also different character models. Sometimes people are casting a few things here or there. It's not great, but it was what I decided to run as my test. Running around Dalaran, and to me, this is kind of the modern day equivalent of old school Ironforge, right? So running around Dalaran, we were able to pull an average frame rate of pretty much 35 to 40 frames per second, regardless of our resolution. And these are all in lowest settings. I did not do a 1080p maximum settings. I tried it briefly. It was a little painful, to say the least, but I'm not showing that here. Now, the 1% lows and the 0.1% lows, those stay pretty static across the board. And actually, you might notice here, the low end I tested was actually 576p, which is below 720p. The reason why I ran these tests this way is, to be honest, the difference in frame rate and 0.1% and 1% lows are pretty negligible. I mean, it's very, very small differences. This is very likely to tell us that we are CPU limited and not GPU limited at any of these resolutions with these settings. Now, of course, 1080p and maximum settings, you'll start to see more of a GPU limitation. The frame rates will come down. But what this means is that our CPU is pretty strongly limited right here. And that's not surprising, because in general, Warcraft has always been a CPU intensive game, and that hasn't really changed too much. With that said, get a slightly better processor or even overclock the processor. Please, you got to remember that our Q6600 is at stock clock speeds for all these tests. If you overclock that from like the 2.4 gigahertz it starts at to even like 2.8 or up to 3, I think you'll see drastic improvements in frame rates across all these benchmarks, especially here in the Legion benchmark. For the next benchmark, I wanted to pull out a classic game, like a really well-known game that usually runs well and people have always enjoyed, but maybe isn't as popular due to some modern updates for newer versions. So here we have Counter-Strike Source. This is not Counter-Strike 1.6 or Counter-Strike Go, Counter-Strike Source. And we ran the in-game benchmark. It's a built-in benchmark for this at lowest settings. It's 720, 900, and 1080p. And although you will see the 1% and 0.1% lows do drop a bit, and even the upper average frame rate drops a little bit from 720 to 1080p, I mean, this system crushes Counter-Strike Source. So we're getting an average frames per second above 250, even at 1080p. We're getting the lowest frames are still, the 0.1% lows are still above 150 frames per second. So all really you can do here is you could crank up the graphical settings a bit. There's not that many options in CS Source. You could crank them up. I think you're still going to pull well over 200 frames per second average. So Counter-Strike Source was super smooth in the system. I was really happy with it. And I did play around a little bit in-game. I didn't run any full benchmarks. And it was as smooth in-game just about as the benchmark. So it's really an enjoyable experience. Now we're slowly moving up these benchmarks from older games to newer games. We're going to get up some of the newer and more popular games soon. But I ran a Dirt 3 benchmark, and again, there's a built-in benchmarking tool, so we ran that on lowest settings. The difference between 720 and 1080p again is almost negligible, which this is just like WoW Legion. This is an example of probably a case where we're CPU limited here rather than GPU limited. We're getting an average frame rate above 100 frames per second, almost 110 frames per second. And our 1% and 0.1% lows never go below 70 frames per second. So you will see some frame drops from the average, but overall, it's a very smooth experience and runs pretty well. You could definitely crank up the graphical settings a little bit in this game and still get easily above 60 frames per second average. Another game with a built-in benchmarking tool, which makes these tests quite a bit easier, was Just Cause 2. And now this was one of the strangest benchmark results for me. Really crazy. There's 3 different benchmarks in Just Cause 2, and I ran all 3 benchmarks for each resolution and then averaged them. So that's why we're getting kind of larger error bars here, because I actually ran 3 different benchmarks. Now, 720p, the game is solid. I mean, it plays pretty well. We get even the lows. I mean, there's a pretty big drop between the 0.1%, 1%, and average, but it's overall, you're not getting anything below 40 frames per second. That's really good. I mean, I'm happy with that. It's very playable at 720p. I don't know how to explain it, but going to 900p, it just crushes it. It's like, you really get like 20 frames per second instead of getting over 100. And I don't think any other benchmark I ever ran in my life has ever shown such a drastic difference from 720p to 900p or 1080p. So Just Cause 2, totally playable at 720p. It's really not at anything above that with this. And these are all lowest settings again. I mean, yeah, I really can't explain it. Now at 720p, you could probably crank up the graphical settings a little bit, and you'd probably end up getting pretty decent average overall, pretty decent frame rates. But at 900 and 1080, even at lowest settings, it just crushed the system. So there's something going on that I haven't quite worked out yet. I tried to run this, I ran this on a few different days even,
still was getting the same result. But yeah, it's a good game at 720p. This is Just Cause 2, it came out probably 7 years ago now. I think 2010 or so it came out. 8 years ago almost. It's a great game. 720p, it still looks pretty good. But for some reason, this $100 system could not run well above 720p. I only ran one 2D game for all my benchmarks. I just wanted to see how a 2D game handles, how the system handles it. And that game was Super Meat Boy. I pretty much just ran level 1-6 because there's no benchmark built in on lowest settings. There's really not a lot of settings options, to be honest, in Super Meat Boy. And the game was fine. I mean, it maxes out at 60 FPS because I think there's a hard limit in the game that's built that way. You can't push above that. But we're easily averaging above 60 frames per second. Our 1% and 0.1% lows pretty much stayed at about 50 plus. So Super Meat Boy, for example, if you want to play 2D games and that's all you want to play, I think in general you're going to be able to really crush 2D games at 1080p with this system. And again, spent under $100 and I can play Super Meat Boy, and it's an older game now, but I can play it without any noticeable frame drops. That's a really great feeling. So I think I didn't run more 2D benchmarks than this. I basically assumed that most 2D games would run similarly, but I wanted to at least throw one of these in here just to see how it looks. Alright, the original Metro 2033. This was one of the most graphically and CPU demanding games when it was released. It was a really tough game. It reminded me of like a new version of Crysis. When Crysis launched, it was so graphically demanding, and Metro 2033 to me was kind of a newer version of that. Now again, we set everything to lowest settings and we ran the in-game benchmarking tool, which again, those in-game benchmarks tools aren't always perfectly representative of actual gameplay, but at least it gives you an idea of how the game might run. Now our average frames per second, you can see dropped from 720, but a little over 40 frames per second, down to 1080p. We're getting a little under 30 frames per second average. Now the 1% and 0.1% lows, those stay pretty stable across the board. We're getting like about 15 frames per second at 1% and around 12 to 13 frames per second at 0.1%. So it's nice to see the frame times at the low end stay pretty consistent. However, the average drops, it drops a good, 10, 15 points from 720 to 1080p. You're really not going to get above 30 frames per second at 1080p on this game. If you crank up the graphical settings, you're going to get crushed. So this is a game where, the resolution, you have to turn it down a little bit. You can probably play pretty comfortably at 900p. If it was me personally, I'd probably go to 720p, turn up the settings a little bit, and then just maintain an average above 30 frames per second. Feel pretty good about that. It's a great game though, and it is decently playable on the system, and you can't really complain too much for spending under $100. So the Final Fantasy XIV Stormblood expansion pack has a separate benchmarking tool you can download. Just Google Final Fantasy XIV Stormblood benchmark, and I decided I'd run that. I don't actually own Final Fantasy, but I wanted to see how the benchmark would do. It's kind of interesting. So again, we're at 720, 900, 1080p, lowest settings, and the average frame rate, 1% and 0.1% lows, stay consistent across the board. I mean, there's pretty much a non-significant difference between all of these. Now, the problem is that average frame rate is still under 30 frames per second. You can't even pull, it's like 27, 28 frames per second average, even at 720p, and the 1% and 0.1% lows get below 15%, or 15 frames per second, excuse me. That's pretty bad. I mean, it's hard to say that that'd be a very enjoyable experience, and this is a synthetic benchmark, so again, or an in-game benchmark and not an actual gameplay. So in gameplay, it's probably going to be a little bit worse. I tend to think that these benchmarks tend to err on the side of being a little bit better than they actually will be in-game. And with that said, because all these frames are pretty much consistent from 720 to 1080p, I'm making the assumption here this is an example of the system being strongly CPU limited, where again, if you overclock this quad core and get from the 2.4 gigahertz up to like 2.8 or 3, I think all of these frames would move up. But as it stands, we're CPU limited here and not GPU limited, which means we might be able to even crank up the settings a little bit and still see the same frame rate since our GPU wasn't being pushed too hard. But yeah, this is probably not, I would say probably not a very playable experience. Now looking at Overwatch, and Overwatch, I mean, it was a game that was designed really well by Blizzard. They really did a great job of making it playable on a wide variety of systems. And here we're doing an actual match, a 6 vs 6 on Ilios. I think it's Ilios Ruins stage. I played as Reaper pretty much the entire time. And at 720p, we're getting frame rates above 70 average. And our 0.1% low is just below 40. It's like maybe 35 frames per second. When we move all the way up to 1080p, we see average frame rate still above 60 frames per second. And a 1% low just below 50, and the 0.1% low just below 30. So we do see, while you're playing, you will see frames drop from above 60 to below 30. It's a pretty nasty drop, to be honest. Again, we're at lowest settings, but the average frame rate still does pull above 60 frames per second. So I'm pretty happy with this. When I was playing it, honestly, I couldn't believe it. I was running around and just wrecking some people as Reaper, even though I was on the system with the lowest settings, even though I was playing, 720p or 900p, and even though I was on a system I built for under $100, I was still killing people. It felt good. It was like every kill shot was a little bit sweeter, knowing that I was on this under $100 system instead of my beast rig over here that's got my Ryzen and my 1080. So it was a pretty good experience, and I honestly had a ton of fun. Overwatch is a great game. I love playing that game, and seeing it run so well into an old, cheap system, I felt really good about that. So this is a testament to the hard work by Blizzard by making such a great game that scales so well, even for what I would consider one of lower end systems. I'll be honest with you, I'd never played Rocket League in my entire life. I've seen the game. It looks like a ton of fun. I mean, who doesn't like cars with rockets and soccer or football, depending on where you live? And however, I'd never played it. So I literally bought Rocket League just for this benchmarking, and I did everything on Arctagon on a 4v4 on lowest settings, 720p, 900, 1080p. And this is much like Overwatch. The average frames per second were above 60, even at 1080p. And unlike Overwatch, the lows, the 1% and 0.1% lows, they stayed pretty good. Instead of dropping down as low as like maybe 30 or something, these stayed above 40, or really above 50. They're about 50 frames per second on the low end at 1080p. So, I mean, you could probably, depending on what you want to do, you could probably turn up the settings a little bit and still pull, above 40 frames per second on the low end and an average about 60 at 1080p. Or if you're at 720p, you could definitely crank up the settings and still have, good frame rate without massive frame drops. But I just want to say, I had a ton of fun playing this game. You might watch me playing a little bit on screen right now and I look terrible. I'm just doing it against some bots, but I'm awful at the game. But I am planning on picking this up a little bit more, and I plan to play a little bit more on my $100 system because it was an enjoyable experience. It was very easy to run. Things loaded quickly. It doesn't look the best, but it plays well, and it's a good game overall. And I was super excited to see that this system ran it pretty well. I know a lot of people go for 120 or 140 or 200 frames per second at Rocket League. I know I don't have that obviously with the system, but maintaining above 60 frames per second average, I'm still pretty happy with. Oh boy, here we go. This is probably the one most people are waiting for. PlayerUnknown's Battlegrounds. There's no built-in benchmarking tool, so I was in roughly the southeast corner of the map as best I could be for each of my tests. I set everything to lowest settings except for, this is the one game where I changed this. The one setting I didn't set to lowest was view distance. I put it on medium because I feel like that's kind of mandatory in PUBG. If you can't at least get medium view distance, you're probably going to get wrecked. So I thought it was important to at least set medium view distance. And oh my gosh, I don't even know where to go with this. To be honest, it's basically unplayable. I was able to actually play, and I was running around, and I killed someone in the game, not just in the beginning, opening load zone. But of the times I would load the game, sometimes, the first time I'd load, pretty much every time I turn on the game and load it, the first time through, I would just die. It would take so long to load that by the time I loaded, I was dropped off the plane with all the other people that took too long to load, and someone had come around and killed us. Or, in a couple of cases, I actually would load in that spot, but no one had killed me yet, and then I would run around and punch and kill the other people that were standing there that didn't load yet. And that was at pretty much any resolution. It doesn't load fast enough on my system to really be consistently competitive. Now, sometimes it did, and I don't know why. It seemed like certainly the first time I'd load, it wouldn't work well. Sometimes, though, the second or third, it wouldn't work well, but by the fourth or fifth, it'd be good. But then maybe the seventh or eighth loading, it would once again have a problem. So it didn't seem like it was caching things to memory that was solving the issue. But 720p, we're getting an average frame rate under 30 frames per second. At 1080p, we're getting an average frame rate under 20 frames per second. And in all cases, we're getting frame drops down to, FPS down to 5 as 0.1% lows, and the 1% lows down to around 10 at 1080p. It's rough. I mean, it's really rough. So it's fun to play around with and try to get it to work. Again, I think if we overclocked our CPU, we'd see some improvements, but this is not just a case of CPU limitation here, because as we go from 720p to 1080p, we see the frame rates do drop, which means we're also GPU limited. So we would have some issues here managing to get this game running well in this system. I think the only thing you can really do is pump a little more money into your build. If you go up to like the $200 range, I think you can probably get a pretty good PUBG system, but under $100, it's really pushing unless you get some miracle donations or something going for your system. I had a lot of fun trying to get it running, but this is probably, of all the benchmarks, this is the one where I really thought was just, unfortunately, not playable.
Anyway, I had a ton of fun with this video. I hope you guys enjoyed it. Thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you next time.